Bitcoin at $1 million per coin. What would it take? What would it take for Bitcoin to become so powerful that Bitcoin could go to $1 million per coin? A digital construct of computer code that we can't touch or feel. Hey everyone, Meet Kevin here. In this video, I want to provide two scenarios. And one of these scenarios got a piece of data this morning that could help the scenario of a $1 million Bitcoin become a reality. But first, it's worth mentioning here that there are a variety of estimates in terms of what the potential future value of Bitcoin could be. Many people think Bitcoin can be worth $75,000, $100,000, $200,000. Kathy Wood over at ARK Invest thinks Bitcoin could easily be worth somewhere around $400,000 per coin. And there are really estimates all over the place. But really? Bitcoin $1 million a coin? Why are we even talking about that? Is that even close to reality? Well, I spoke with Ali Moz this weekend, and we had an interview here on the channel, on the podcast version of this channel. And folks, this is the clip of him talking about Bitcoin. And just listen to what his belief is in the long term.
I think there's a world where like 10 years from now, each Bitcoin is $1 million.
Oh my God. You can see I'm actually in disbelief because just the concept of Bitcoin going to $1 million seems so detached from reality today. But then again, we're talking about this digital construct that just 3 months ago was trading for not $52,000, but $17,000. And if we go back a year ago, was trading for a low during the pandemic of around $5,000 per coin. This has now 10x'd just over the last year. And if we go out to 5 years, the current bull run of Bitcoin has been outpaced by any bull run we have ever seen before for Bitcoin. Now, it certainly helps that PayPal and Square have bought a ton of cryptocurrency, Bitcoin, so that people can invest in Bitcoin on their platform or through their platforms like Cash App or directly with PayPal. It helps that Apple has suggested, hey, let's integrate Bitcoin payments into Apple Pay. And it certainly helps that Elon Musk, the meme lord of Twitter, pushes Bitcoin as potentially the most important cryptocurrency of the world, the one that will be on top of all others. And as he says, maybe this was inevitable. And we're not sure if he means moving to the blockchain was inevitable or Tesla investing $1.5 billion into Bitcoin was inevitable, or maybe in hindsight, Dogecoin becoming the biggest meme of cryptocurrency, but yet also making people a ton of freaking money. Well, folks, let's talk about the potential scenarios that I see for Bitcoin. So scenario number one is one that we've talked about before, and I'm going to give a quick recap on scenario number one, but I'm most interested in talking about scenario number two. It's one that we haven't really talked about on this channel. It's one that refers to Bitcoin as $1 million a coin and what it would take to actually get it to go there. So here are the scenarios. Scenario number one in recap is the scenario of the Federal Reserve. Inflation basically drives Bitcoin's price up as inflation rears itself in March, April, and May. But as inflation recedes, when we look at year-over-year inflation data, we expect there to be a spike in inflation in March, April, and May because we'll be comparing to last year's lows, and then that'll level off. And when inflation recedes, we could see Bitcoin pricing retract because people invest in Bitcoin as a potential inflation hedge. Now, not everyone. Everyone does not use Bitcoin as an inflation hedge, but enough people do that even just the perception of inflation and more money printing seems to lead Bitcoin's price to go up. And so scenario number one says, okay, well, if that's true, and even if it's perceived to be true, and even if it's only perceived to be true by half of Bitcoin purchasers, or even a quarter of all Bitcoin purchasers, then it would make sense that as inflation expectations rise, Bitcoin will go up. If inflation expectations fall, Bitcoin could fall. And so scenario number one says, the Fed is right. The Fed sees inflation coming again, March, April, May. Bitcoin goes up. Bitcoin settles when inflation goes away. Bitcoin goes up when inflation comes back, which might be when we begin to open our economy again, and inflation comes in the form of all of a sudden a ton of people spending money again on food and services and travel and retail and hospitality. And all of a sudden we get a short-term inflation boom until that settles off and we get prices falling again or stabilizing again, which means inflation's going away, and maybe Bitcoin follows that same up and that same down. Scenario number one is basically taking the Federal Reserve's inflation expectations and merging them with what people's expectations or fears might be for inflation and how those might manifest in the price of Bitcoin. Notice when Congress talks about spending money or we get closer to passing a stimulus package, Bitcoin goes up. But more interesting to me is scenario number two, because it's one we haven't talked about that much before, and I always like looking at alternate scenarios, because no matter what we think or believe or think evidence points to, there's always the possibility that we're missing something. After all, people measure inflation in dozens of different ways. We have asset price inflation, real estate stock market. We have food price inflation, commodity inflation, regular consumer purchases inflation. Inflation rears itself in crazy ways. But there's a metric that came out this morning that came as a surprise. And this surprise becomes very important for expectation number two. By the way, quick note, before I talk about scenario number two, I just want to mention that I just wired $250,000 to BlockFi to start my investment into Bitcoin at BlockFi. Yes, my first 9 Bitcoin are at Robinhood, and Robinhood did announce that one day I'll be able to transfer that Bitcoin to a crypto wallet, which I look forward to. But for now, I will be buying my new Bitcoin with BlockFi. And if you want to get a free $250 or up to $250 when you sign up for an account with BlockFi, make sure to go to metkevin.com/BF. That's like BlockFi, metkevin.com/BF. Check that out, and when you sign up and deposit money, you will get up to $250 totally for free, and you could get that reward in your cryptocurrency of choice. Take a look at this. A CNBC headline article, U.S. producer prices post biggest gain since 2009. The U.S. producer prices increased by the most since 2009 in January as the cost of goods and services surged, suggesting inflation at the factory gate was starting to creep up. The Producer Price Index, or PPI, for final demand jumped 1.3% last month, the biggest gain since December 2009, when the government revamped the series, the Labor Department said on Wednesday. Folks, here's the chart of the Producer Price Index. And if we zoom out, we could see the Producer Price Index going all the way really back to the 1920s. But what's most relevant to us, obviously, is the more near-term or recent term. And that brings us all the way back to, well, 2009 and the recession here. And we notice this massive spike in the Producer Price Index going into the 2008 recession. In fact, things really hit the fan in September of 2008. Many would argue the midst of the global financial crisis and potentially even the start. And we'll notice that the Producer Price Index increased going right into it, only to come crashing down starting essentially in the September 2008 reading. Now, what's interesting, and we're not here to talk about the next market crash by any means, but let's zoom in specifically to the recent Producer Price Index here and see how this might relate to Bitcoin. So here's the thing. In January of 2020, the Producer Price Index was 199.3, and the PPI plummeted in February, March, April, and didn't start recovering again until May. This means when we do a year-over-year comparison, and we get February's data, which we'll get in March, we're going to see a comparison from here to a line that keeps going up, which means inflation data and the PPI are about to come in real hot, especially on a year-over-year metric. They're going to come in very, very high. I mean, look at this trajectory here. We went from 200.6 to 204.3. Let's say we go to 208 in February of 2021, and we compare 208 to 196.7. Well, we take 208 divided by 196.7, and we'll have an inflation reading of 5.7% year-over-year on the PPI. If we go to, let's say we go to 210 in the next month, in March, but then we compare to 193, or better yet, we go to 210 in April, let's say, and we compare to April's data. Inflation will look like it is somewhere around 13% on a year-over-year metric. What's fascinating here, because we know we're comparing year over year, and this is where the scenario gets really interesting. What's fascinating about the psychology that's going to happen when we see these scary data is that we might actually begin to anchor our expectations for those 3 months and then onward, that inflation is here. And Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell says that inflation works in really interesting ways. Inflation occurs when people expect inflation. So if we see 3 months of year over year, oh my God, what looks like really high inflation, and all of a sudden people's inflation expectations skyrocket. And we start seeing, oh my gosh, people think, forget about 2% inflation, we might see 3 or 4% inflation, and that might be here to stay. That motivates producers and consumers, or maybe not consumers, but that motivates producers and suppliers to raise their prices in anticipation of inflation, and then you self-inflict inflation. And if inflation then does not fall off once we get to, let's say, summer 2020 data compared to summer 2021 data, because all of a sudden we're self-fulfilling inflation, Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell says that is how inflation can work. It's very weird how it works, but it can work that way. If that happens, and a substantial chunk of people believe that, oh my gosh, Bitcoin is the savior when it's time to invest in an inflationary time, which we haven't seen in a while. We haven't really seen it since 2017, 2018, when we really started seeing rates trick up, which also happens to align with the last insane run of Bitcoin. Then it's entirely possible that we could see people actually invest more money into Bitcoin during not only these 3 months, but thereafter. People start taking money out of stocks and real estate and taking anything they can get their hands on and plowing it into Bitcoin, because some people perceive it to be an inflation hedge. Again, whether or not it is does not matter. It's the perception that matters. And remember what happened last time we started seeing inflation, we started seeing rates go up to combat inflation? Folks, it's right here. Take a look at this. This run, November of 2017, right here, this run was right as the Fed was really starting to talk about raising rates in 2018, and that's what they did. Now, obviously, that run-up wasn't sustainable, and it consolidated, but what's interesting is if you zoom into around November of 2018, that's when the stock market started falling, but it's also when the Federal Reserve said, we're gonna pause on raising rates for the time being. Inflation estimates are coming in lower. Right here, November, the PPI comes in lower than expected. And what happened to Bitcoin prices when it came in lower than expected? It's this drop right here. From that November reading, you get a decline going into December. Now look, I'm not trying to say that Bitcoin's price is solely the result of whatever this random measure is of the producer price index. I'm not suggesting that if CPI does something crazy, we are going to guaranteed see Bitcoin go up. But I believe that in scenario number 2, if the Federal Reserve is wrong, and they're proven wrong because inflation sticks around, it could be because people expect inflation to come, inflation comes, and when inflation comes, people flee to Bitcoin as a reserve asset. And when inflation comes, and certainly when that comes, if the Federal Reserve makes any kind of U-turn on their policy decision and says, folks, we got to raise rates to dampen inflation, guess what's going to happen? We're going to see a stock sell-off. We're going to see a real estate sell-off. Bitcoin will already be much more mainstream when this happens in the next few months. It's obviously already much more mainstream now than it used to be. And in my opinion, it's entirely possible that Bitcoin could begin its run to $1 million in 2021. Now, I don't believe that Bitcoin is going to go to $1 million in 2021, but I think the run of Bitcoin going in that direction could be highly correlated to what inflation does. I don't really know which scenario is going to happen. If I was a betting person, I would probably put my bets on the belief that there's an 70 to 80% chance we don't see this self-inflicted sustained inflation. And I could be wrong. Inflation, after all, we know is not something that generally follows modern economies that are expanding. We have a modern economy that's expanding. It's expanding at a slower rate than it used to, but it's expanding. And it's expanding through technological innovation. And technology tends to create deflation, not inflation. Prices come down, not up. Sure, we can keep running the money printer, but at some point, Congress's appetite for running the money printer will stop. And that's where I believe it's probable that we're going to see temporary inflation that'll soften. That could lead to very volatile cryptocurrency movements over these periods of going through inflation to not. I think that scenario is more likely. That's more likely where I'm going to place my bets. Now, I do believe that Bitcoin could triple within these periods. It wouldn't shock me to see Bitcoin $150,000 by April, May, or June. Wouldn't shock me at all, especially when we start getting some of these crazy year-over-year inflationary figures. But we also can't predict the future. And so the other scenario is also a real possibility that, surprisingly, inflation sticks around. And people do raise their prices because the expectations of inflation are here. And all of a sudden now we fulfill the expectation. We get money velocity that comes back up because people are spending more. Right now we've got 25% more money in circulation, but people are spending way less. So it's hard to have inflation because there's not so much demand. But if everybody goes back to spending like crazy, kind of like we used to do, well, yeah, inflation could be here. And so that brings up the possibility that, sure, there's, in my opinion, a real 20 to 30% chance that Bitcoin could literally go on a rocket ship to the moon and stay on a rocket ship to the moon if inflation stays here. Now, I do have to give credit to some folks who say, hey, Kevin, look, Bitcoin's price has nothing to do with inflation. And there are some people who say that. But what I would challenge is how many folks invest in Bitcoin as an opportunity to escape the fiat and to avoid or potentially hedge against inflation. And the more people invest in that, the more buying power we have to actually drive Bitcoin's prices when inflation shows up. Anyway, let me know which scenario you think is more likely. Is scenario 1 more likely where, yeah, we see Bitcoin go up, it's not going to be anything extreme, but Bitcoin could come down again after inflation expectations and actual inflation subsides? Or are we going into a hyperinflation environment? Are we going to see sustained high inflation? Is the Fed going to be wrong? And is Bitcoin going to basically follow the market up or follow inflation up and become a primary hedge against inflation and maybe actually really be that hedge that we're looking for? I don't know, but I want to know what you think. Let me know in the comments down below. Make sure to get your free up to $250 with BlockFi via the link down below, or go to metkevin.com/BF like BlockFi. And folks, we'll see you in the next video.